evidence session for the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Before I introduce our expert witness this morning, I'd like to just explain a little bit about the work of the committee and the review that we're currently engaged on. The committee was founded in 1994 by the then Prime Minister, Sir John Major, to advise the Prime Minister on arrangements for upholding ethical standards of conduct across public life in the UK. That committee under Lord Nolan articulated the 7 principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership, which set out universal standards for conduct in public life. And as a committee, we continue to own and promote those principles. We're not a regulator. We do not field complaints or comment on the outcome of individual cases, but we advise the Prime Minister and the government of the day on the processes, procedures, and regulations in place to uphold high standards of public conduct. We also promote best practice on maintaining high standards within public sector organisations. For the committee's 25th anniversary in 2019, we commissioned a piece of academic research on mapping the complex tapestry of standards bodies that has emerged over the last 25 years. Following that, we decided to launch a review analysing the strengths and weaknesses of our current standards arrangements. And the committee has done this twice before, most recently in our 2013 report, Standards Matter. We're taking an overall look at how well ethical standards are upheld in public life, looking at any potential gaps and weaknesses in our standards regulators, and we'll also be providing some best practice guidance. So this opportunity is for us to hear the views of Mr. Dave Penman, the General Secretary of the First Division Association, Public Sector and Civil Service Union. And since 2012, Dave has been the General Secretary of the FDA. From the committee side, we have with us today Monisha Shah, one of our independent members, Dr. Jane Martin, another independent member, and Lord Stunnell, one of our political members representing the Liberal Democrat Party, and Right Honourable General Jeremy Wright, MP from the Conservative Party. We are live streaming this session to the committee's YouTube channel, and I would remind all watching this that the committee is not asking about the outcomes of any recent or past cases, including matters currently being investigated by the courts. So, Dave Penman, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning. Could I start by asking what your members' views are on how well the Nolan Principles are being upheld across public life?
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence. I think in general, one of the problems with all of these issues is it's where those kind of standards fall down, or where there's a crisis that gets the public attention, rather than the kind of general behaviour or standards of ministers, which obviously is the main concern in relation to our members. I think whenever you talk to civil servants, they have nothing but respect for the enormously difficult job that ministers have to do, the increasing media scrutiny around what they do and how government operates. They understand, because they're working hand in glove with ministers, around the pressures that come to bear on them. And I think in the vast majority of cases, civil servants see that actually ministers are doing a really difficult job in trying to do it well and trying to uphold those general standards. Of course, there are instances when that's not the case, but I don't think that's really the lived experience of most civil servants, which is why I think when it does fall down and when there are issues that come to the fore, it's really important that they're dealt with well, because otherwise it taints actually the majority of behaviours around ministerial conduct.
So that's quite, you paint quite an encouraging picture, in the sense that generally speaking, you think that ministers and officials are seeking to meet high standards. How important is it that what happens in Westminster particularly sets a tone for standards across the whole of public life, both including public service delivery within public sector and also for private companies working on public service delivery?
Well, I think kind of all roads lead to Whitehall and Westminster. Ultimately, your previous evidence session talked about actually some of those ministers of state also have direct responsibilities for the conduct and standards in a whole range of public services, whether it's those in the private sector delivering them or whether it's local government, NHS, elsewhere in the public sector. So I think for them individually around their standards and their government departments and civil servants they deal with, and how that sets a tone across the entire country, it's absolutely critical. It's not just about their relationship with the civil servants or the employer that they're working in as a government department is. And clearly, ultimately, that's the same with the Prime Minister. You know, there is no one in the country who essentially sets that tone in a way around kind of public standards and behaviour like the Prime Minister does, whether that's good or bad. I think is an enormous impact beyond just the direct responsibilities that they individually have.
Thank you. Are there areas of particular concern on standards that you would want our committee to be aware of?
I think what we've witnessed, particularly over the last few years, is a challenge for that kind of standards infrastructure dealing with what I would term kind of behavioural issues, what we would do in terms of regulating the kind of relationship and behaviour between people in a workplace. And that gets complicated as well because of not only the power dynamic, but that power dynamic applies in a normal workplace between those at the top of an organisation and those further down, but also the fact that some of those individuals, whether it's ministers, whether it's members of parliament or parliamentarians, are not employees. So they have a kind of employment type context, but actually the relationship and the ability to regulate those behaviours and relationship is quite difficult. And I think that's really where, for us in particular, we have seen the challenges of how to deal with that. I've seen what's happened is some of those issues have come to the fore over the last couple of years, but they were there before. If you look at what happened in Parliament, you know, it goes back more than a decade when we were trying to challenge issues around how effective the processes were. But it wasn't until we saw the kind of explosion of concern around the Me Too movement that really kind of came to a head. And I think that's really where there is this real challenge, as we've seen with the ministerial code and we've seen with the arrangements in Parliament.
So you're drawing attention there both to, as it were, the ministerial arrangements, but also standards issues in Parliament itself?
Yeah, I think they're very similar, and there's a very similar dynamic around power and abuse of power. So you have this situation where you have people who are very powerful in a kind of workplace setting. So for us, looking after our members in a workplace setting, so they wield quite significant power. And also then there is a challenge around the regulation of those individuals, and where that's wielded disproportionately or inappropriately, how is that then challenged? And if it can't be effectively challenged, what is the consequence of that? Does it almost encourage that behaviour? If people think and have a prevalence for behaving in a particular way, and they know there's not an effective regime for holding them to account for it, what does that do in relation to those behaviours? And I think that particularly that we saw in Parliament was our concern, that it almost encouraged that type of behaviour before, because people knew they couldn't be held to account. And if you look at the scale of what Dame Laura Cox uncovered when she held her kind of independent investigation compared to the numbers, you know, no one had used the process as it was up to that point in time, it gave, I think, a bit of an indication of that.
So does that mean that with the increased levels of independence and accountability for behaviour in Parliament, that you think the situation there is more encouraging for those who work in that environment?
I think absolutely. I mean, it was a long slog in Parliament to get to this point. It is very difficult around individuals who hold power, giving up that power, and that was one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us. I think what was critical in Parliament was the issue of independent decision making. You know, we talked a lot of times shorthand about, you know, the MPs marking their own homework. And I think also what we saw in Parliament was the influence of the political parties themselves. And where you saw that conflict of interest between the organisations, the parties, and also the MPs themselves, to some degree protecting their own, in relation to that, that's where the difficulty was. How do you lessen the power away from those individuals and those organisations to regulate the conduct? Because ultimately, that's what they want. They clearly were using those issues kind of furthered their ends, political ends in terms of parties, around that. And it also created this real dynamic around, something could be happening around the behaviour between a member of parliament and an employee at a time when that member of parliament was actually critical to the interests of a party. For whatever means, whether it's in government or out of government, and that's when you get those sorts of conflicts, and that's why you need that kind of independent decision-making process that ultimately Parliament has decided to instigate.
So you focus very much on behaviours. There have been some public disquiet around some areas such as procurement, public procurement and public appointments. Do you pick up any concern or disquiet amongst your members on issues of that sort?
I mean, I think the last 18 months has created a kind of unsettlement, shall I say, around civil servants. They feel we've had issues of concern around the kind of general principles of the Civil Service Code in a way that I haven't seen since I've been at the FDA, been at the FDA over 20 years. I think this is a government that acts in a different way. That was pre-COVID. It takes decisions in a different way, and I think that has been quite unsettling. Some people think that's a good thing, a bad thing, but I mean, ultimately, I think it unsettled that landscape of what people think were kind of foundations around government would operate, and I think that's then lent itself to some issues around how people have been appointed, how some decisions have been made, the kind of commitment to transparency. In different governments and rightly or wrongly have kind of different views around all of this about who they're accountable to, whether it's the media, the public generally, or that, and have a kind of different approach. And I think this government certainly has had a different approach to that, and that's been quite unsettling, as well as then some of the issues around civil servants themselves, the willingness, I think, to brief against civil servants. That creates quite a difficult general culture and environment for civil servants. So I don't think you can take one of those issues on their own, looking at that whole culture around how kind of civil servants feel. And we've done a little bit of polling of this about members about what they think around the kind of the kind of general culture and atmosphere is in the civil service.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Over the last 25 years, we've seen a proliferation of codes of conduct and governing behaviour of MPs and ministers and civil servants and those in government. Do you think that this has improved upholding ethical standards, or does it just add great complexity?
I think it kind of, I think if you look at it from the outside, you'll see a variety of codes of conduct and protocols around all of this. But if you're applying it, so if you're a minister or you're a civil servant, I think you have greater clarity around how that impacts upon you. I think the Nolan Principles are fantastic because it sets that overall framework for everyone, that actually the majority of those in public service, whether it's those in elected office or who are employed in public sector, that's what's attracted them in the first place. They want actually to deliver good public services. And so those kind of principles, underpin their motivation to do their job anyway. So I think it's clearer if you are a practitioner in public service around what are the rules and how they apply to me. I think looking at that as an overall perspective of what as the consequence of all of those is probably more of a remit for your kind of committee to look at, but whether that has an impact. I think the lived experience of civil servants, when they will understand, they can look at the ministerial code, see what are the boundaries there. They know their own civil service code and what that means, and it's critical and vital and important to them, sort of stuff. So I think they get how the kind of various points of regulation interact.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Jane Martin.
Thank you very much, Lord Evans. Good morning, Mr. Penman. I think the next few areas of questioning really are all following up on the ministerial code in particular, and the role of the independent advisor and all of that. So may I start by just asking you sort of the more general question really about the ministerial code? You've talked about the lived experience of all your members. So generally speaking, of course, would you give us your view on behalf of your members of the ministerial code? Would you say it was fit for purpose? Would you say that civil servants do feel that it's doing a good job? And if not, how does that affect morale more broadly in the civil service?
I mean, I think there are, as I've said, I think there are particular challenges around the code in relation to behavioural issues. And if I can pick that up first, I think one of the elements we've seen is that essentially, if you think about it, and again, we had this in Parliament around the kind of processes you need to deal with those kind of issues, and separating those from issues around conflicts of interest when it comes to investments, or the kind of propriety of what ministers do in relation to their day job or their own personal interests. You know, when you're talking about those sorts of behavioural issues, when you're talking about bullying or harassment or potentially sexual harassment, it needs a very different process to deal with. It needs to be centred around those who are at the wrong end of the power dynamic, to give them rights and responsibilities, to be transparent, to build confidence that people can raise a complaint in the first place because they understand how that will be dealt with. They'll understand if they're not happy with how it's dealt with, how they can challenge that, and what all of that process is laid out and dealing with. And one of the things we found, I think Parliament's a really good example of this, when you don't have confidence in that process, people simply do not come forward with it. And that means they need to know from the start of the process, how do you raise a complaint, to the end of the process, how is the decision made, and they will judge that. Because raising a complaint against the most powerful people in the country, particularly in something that's so sensitive, like those kind of behavioural issues, you know, is such a difficult thing for an individual to do. And I don't think you could say, if you were a civil servant just now, you know, and say, okay, then you've got a concern, how would you raise that? Where can you go and get clarity of how that would be dealt with? How would you be supported? What are your rights in any process? What's the transparency around that decision-making process? All of that isn't there. It's an opaque system. And when the changes were made under Theresa May to change the ministerial code to include the definition around a kind of bullying and be clear about bullying, one of the points we said was, look, are we really saying that that's enough? Did ministers not know that they weren't to bully their civil servants? And actually all you need to do is define that and suddenly it will stop. You need to build confidence those who could be subject to those behaviours. And I think that's really found wanting. And what it demonstrates is really the ministerial code is not the place for that. You need separate processes for dealing with that. And ultimately that would end up at the ministerial code, because clearly there is a point where the Prime Minister, faced with the outcome of those processes, has to make a decision, and that's, you know, would be articulated in the power essentially would sit around the ministerial code. But those issues around behaviour need to be completely separated out from it and redesigned around the people challenging, not designed essentially as the code is to give all of the political power to the kind of Prime Minister, where the tendency therefore potentially is that they will make a political decision rather than a kind of fair decision on it. And I think that is the real big challenge around the ministerial code. We're really using something that's not fit for purpose for it's now being applied. And that was the same in Parliament with how the Standards Committee were operating. We needed to take all of that out and look at how things were investigated, how decisions were made, the range of sanctions that applied, and deal with it completely separately.
No, thank you. That's extremely clear and interesting. I mean, are there any other points you would like to make about the way in which the code operates? I take what you've just said, and I understand that's the most important issue, but just aside from that, are there any, I mean, you know, people say it's, you know, it's a hybrid document. People say that, you know, the process should be generally more accountable. Do you have any more views on behalf of your members on the way in which it is operating, notwithstanding your earlier criticism?
I mean, I think the issue around, as you touched on with the earlier evidence, around the kind of Prime Minister's role in instigating investigations. Essentially the Prime Minister acts as kind of judge, jury and, chief constable in deciding whether to even initiate an investigation or not. And that kind of separation of those kind of potential conflicts of interest, I think, is critical to then the confidence in whatever process you have, whether it's the existing process or whether it's a new process around behaviours. I think that issue around where you have those potential conflicts and you have the potential for a political choice to be made rather than one that's centred around ethical standards or evidence is the real danger that kind of undermines the code. So we would like to see, I think, a greater separation of those powers, whether it's the power to investigate and also around the kind of findings of fact as far as possible as you can stretch it to keep it independent and separate from a political decision at the end.
Thank you. I mean, would you say more broadly now, looking across the public sector, that the kind of lack of confidence that you've articulated in the ministerial code specifically. I mean, does that have a knock-on effect, do you think, about other areas of public service? I mean, does it resonate? You know, are there ripples that go beyond the specifics of working for a minister, as it were?
It does in a way, because I think what it does is and how the kind of last couple of years have kind of manifested themselves. I think it's damaged confidence in the civil service, to not just about those issues of behaviours, but also around the relationship with ministers. So we asked our senior civil service members about this issue, whether they had confidence in the ministerial code. 85% said they didn't as a way of regulating behaviour. And also 2/3 said that they felt that their ability to speak truth unto power, to give ministers difficult advice, was being damaged and undermined. And I think those things are inevitably related in relation to what is the balance of power and how confident do civil servants feel about challenging in the role that they have ministers, or in that case just even providing difficult advice that a minister doesn't particularly want to hear. And that's the job of a civil servant. That makes for better governance. So I think there are consequences here for how government operates and how the civil service is able to do its job that it's kind of constitutionally set up to do, to be independent, to be permanent, to give impartial advice. Sure. And that therefore has inevitably consequences in how government operates, as well as the kind of reputational damage of standards. You know, if the kind of standards regime for ministers is damaged, is felt to be partial rather than impartial, I think then that kind of sets a tone elsewhere. As I said earlier on, all kind of roads lead to Whitehall and the Prime Minister on this, and it's setting standards more broadly.
Thank you very much. That's all for me. I think it's Jeremy, you have some questions next.
Or is it Manisha, actually? To Manisha, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Penman. So my questions are specifically about how the ministerial code works. And I think you've said this already, but I just wanted to make sure we understood you correctly in terms of, you know, the Prime Minister is presently the final arbiter of the ministerial code. And if I understood you correctly, I think you are saying that may not be the best thing. Is it your view that the advisor should have the authority to declare a breach of the ministerial code?
Yeah, I mean, I think on matters of fact, then ultimately that there has to be a kind of interpretation, a decision around the evidence that's laid. And if you're saying actually you're trying to avoid the potential for a conflict of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest and kind of political interference in that decision, then I think whether it's the independent advisor, whether it's a different process, then that's what you would want to do. I think there are clearly there's a political role in relation to sanction and what is the power of the Prime Minister and how does that apply around his cabinet and his ministers and the role of the ministerial code and how he implements that. And it's trying to avoid the separate or trying to create a kind of separation between those. And I think to build confidence in a process which is dealing with those sorts of complaints, particularly the ones that our members would raise, which are not necessarily about the kind of financial conflicts of ministers, but behavioural challenges around it, having that separated to the point of a decision, a meaningful decision on a breach of the code, I think would be very welcome. And then that would be seen to be independent of political interference. It's a different issue on sanction. I think and one of the things we did do with Parliament was try to press them on a range of sanctions, because it was a similar situation there. It was all or nothing, which resulted in a lot of nothing and not a lot of all, to be honest.
Yeah, so you slightly anticipated one of my questions, but may I just stick with your point at the moment? I mean, in terms of just aligned to the final decision of the authority, what is your view on whether the advisor should also have the independent ability to publish their reports and findings? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think confidence in a process is critical, and transparency is key to that. I think it creates difficulties in the issues that we're talking about. So if you're publishing a report which is about behaviours, it's not about whether a minister's investment was a conflict with their responsibilities, but it's about an individual and the conduct of individuals, then that creates some difficulties around this issue of what you publish and what you don't. But you can go over that. I think ultimately, you can deal with the level of detail that's required around different types of investigations to protect individuals, but having some sort of commitment that there will always be a transparent kind of publication of the outcome, so the public can see it, and those individuals who perhaps have an interest in it, if it's a behavioural issue, can see what that outcome is. It would be critical to ensuring the confidence of it.
Thank you. And so to my final point, which you touched upon before, which is this question about whether any breach of the ministerial code is a resignation offence, or should there be a graduated a series of possible sanctions? And you have already said that that's your view. I mean, it is, in terms of ministers, it's slightly different. What in your view, what might be the sorts of sanctions that might be possible for different kinds of breaches?
So if we think about it, and we always try and bring this back to an employment context. If this was a civil servant found to be bullying another civil servant, there would be a range of sanctions about warning at various levels. You have a kind of range of employment sanctions up to dismissal. And that's supposed, intended to recognise that not all offences, so to speak, are the same. And so you could look at that in relation to ministers. There could be issues around, obviously a minister not necessarily being sacked, but subject to a period of warning around their conduct and behaviour, particularly if you're looking at issues like kind of bullying and harassment and those kind of issues that are sometimes can be relatively low level around, an isolated incident rather than a pattern of behaviour, and that would seem to be an appropriate sanction. So you're saying, yes, there are a range of issues that perhaps have created a context here, and therefore that feels like the right response to it. That gets difficult, I think, because of the public nature of it, but I think that's the reality of what we're dealing with ministers. There's an inevitability here that it may feel disproportionate that a minister essentially publicly gets shamed around their behaviour in a way, even if they aren't sacked. But all of those things, I think you try and find balance to in relation to how you deal with it. I think they're quite difficult, and that's what we found in Parliament about trying to create a sanctions regime in Parliament where there were similar things around it. They're not impossible in relation to this, and I think that's what we try and do. And I think there would be a role for the independent advisor in recommending sanctions as well, to give the kind of context of what the evidence that they've found, whether there was any context at all, or whether it's a kind of egregious breach around it and what should follow. And again, that's similar to what's happening in Parliament, where there are recommendations made to the independent panel around sanction.
Thank you very much. That's all I had today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Wright.
Thank you. I suppose I should start by declaring my interest, along with one other member of the committee on this panel this morning, as somebody who has been at one time subject to the ministerial code. But I wanted to take you back, if I could, Mr. Penman, to what you said earlier on about your concerns as to how the ministerial code operates, and specifically investigations into potential breaches. And I think you said that you were concerned the Prime Minister was judge, jury and chief constable in this respect. Can I take you to the chief constable part? So going back to the beginning of the process, when an initial complaint is made, do you believe that what should happen is that the independent investigator should have the power and authority to initiate their own investigations rather than have be directed by the Prime Minister to do so?
Absolutely. I think that's critical. Clearly, if the point of this is to create a confidence in a process, then the idea that an investigation can only be started by the person who's going to make the final decision on it just creates such an obvious conflict in relation to all of this. So it's the way to stop difficult decisions having to be made under the ministerial code, is to stop any investigation in the first place. So I think that is both critical as a standards regime, and also in terms of giving confidence to those individuals who may want to raise a complaint about a minister, particularly in relation to their behaviour. If they think the first hurdle for that is the Prime Minister having to say yea or nay in relation to investigation, it's going to damage their confidence to raise a complaint in the first place.
And if you were redesigning the process, that's one element. What would you see as the appropriate role in that context in terms of the initiation of investigations for the Prime Minister and for the Cabinet Secretary?
Well, clearly, I mean, your previous evidence session touched on this a little bit around if you have, it depends on the role of the kind of independent advisor. If they've got a kind of more central role on this, advised by a kind of secretariat and the Cabinet Secretary, I think as long as there's confidence on the independence of the independent advisor, you know, all of those things are interlinked around, because I come back to centre it on, if you're a civil servant who wants to raise a complaint about the behaviour of a minister, what do you think is critical around your confidence that that decision is going to be made and not be influenced by the kind of politics of the day? And I think there's a role there for the civil service in that, and being independent and separate from government. I think there's a role for the independent advisor, but all of those things are combined about whether you think the independent advisor is truly independent or not, so how they're appointed. All of those things create this confidence in a process that what you can get is a truly independent decision. Very much like if it was breaking the law, how would the decision be taken around conducting an investigation, whether it's a police or a prosecution? That is supposed to be independent from political interference. There's a separation of those powers, and that doesn't just have to be independent, it has to have, you know, the transparency and appearance of independence to create confidence in it. So I think it really kind of depends on how all of those interlinked things happen and are created, and how independent that independent advisor is and appears to be. But certainly I think there's no reason why it couldn't be modelled on the kind of structure we've got just now, but just separate them, take those powers a little bit further.
The other aspect of the investigation process you heard us ask about in the last session was resources. And can I ask you your view on that? At the moment, as you appreciate, the independent advisor relies on resources allocated by the Cabinet Office, essentially civil servants, your members in many cases, assisting the independent advisor. Do you believe that needs to change, or is that working well as far as you can tell? I
think you know, the civil service never has enough resource, and essentially has to kind of expand and contract based on demand. But it does ultimately, I think, it's, you know, you couldn't sit there with a kind of pool of civil servants or kind of support staff just waiting for investigations and stuff. I think, you know, centering that around the kind of Cabinet Office, the ability for them to draw in resources and expertise as needed, I think is a sensible approach to it. In relation both the kind of independence of those who would be conducting it and also the ability to pull in extra resources. And certainly I've not experienced any concerns that essentially investigations are being frustrated through lack of resource. I don't think that's really been an issue or an issue of concern around it. And clearly the Cabinet Secretary would have a role in that, and ensuring that, as it does with any number of functions in government, it would be appropriate resource. So it seems like the best place for it, rather than having to create an entirely kind of independent body or independent resources.
Understood. Thank you very much. That's all I have, Chair. I think Lord Stunnell is next.
Thank you very much. Lord Stunnell.
Thank you very much. Can we move on to the question of special advisors? What are your views on the current?
That's slightly unfortunate. For some reason, Stunnell has frozen just at the moment of his first question. So let's give him a few seconds to. Andrew, you froze just as you started to give your question. So I wonder whether you could ask it again.
Okay, am I?
You are now audible.
Am I broadcasting now? Well, my question, Mr. Penman, is about special advisors, as to whether you still have concerns around the powers and accountability of special advisors.
Yes, as in, I think we're unclear about where they kind of currently sit.
We don't seem to be getting anywhere here.
Sorry, Andrew, can I suggest, I suspect there's a bandwidth issue. I wonder whether if you tried without your camera, because we did hear your question, but you're breaking up slightly. So it may be that without the camera, you'd be more fluent, as it were. but I think Mr. Penman's probably heard the question and is in a position to respond.
Okay, yes, I think our concerns remain, because I think there's a lack of clarity around the role of ministers and number 10 and the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff in relation to special advisors. Clearly this centred around individuals who were performing that role and wanted to make changes to it. When the model contract was changed and special advisors were asked to change and sign up to the new contract, which essentially created a kind of hybrid management structure. We raised concerns directly with the Cabinet Office around that and what that meant about the accountability of ministers through the ministerial code. It wasn't just around that issue, though that issue obviously was important, but it was also about how special advisors were actually directly being managed and organised, which kind of was becoming evident. And I think that it created, we felt, a real difficulty around that direct accountability line and support for ministers, actually, in relation to their special advisors. And you know, the Public Administration Committee had looked into this, I think, in 2012. They had envisaged this potential approach of a kind of more central pool and management control from number 10, and had indicated that they felt that that essentially would damage the ability of ministers to do their job. We supported that kind of conclusion at the time and supported it in relation to how it was being applied over the last 18 months, because I think civil servants absolutely value the role of special advisors. They are critical in maintaining the impartiality of civil servants, as well as assisting ministers to do their job. And for special advisors, if they're good special advisors and they know their minister well, then civil servants know that, get to understand, they can ask and get a broader context around the kind of politics that are going on at the time and make their job easier and better. And if you're unsure where that accountability lies, whether it's with the minister or whether it's to number 10 or the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, I think it creates confusion and mistrust. I don't think it was fair to special advisors either. They were being moved about almost as a central pool, it would appear. I mean, again, we read about this, we find out about this, where it's not actually a kind of constitutional debate or a transparent debate that takes place. But, you know, it would appear that special advisors were kind of routinely being moved around almost like a kind of civil service resource, and that as well, I think, undermined that very special relationship between ministers and advisors, and undermined a kind of cabinet government where actually you need really good and strong ministers with powerful and strong advisors to ensure that they can do their job properly as well. So it would appear that whilst there have been some personnel changes and some indications that that approach is changing, I think there's still a lack of clarity, because with lack of clarity how it was adopted in the first place. Was it just practice? And there's a lack of clarity around exactly how it's operating now.
Thank you. Well, Andrew, I'm not sure whether you were able to hear Mr. Penman's response to your first question, and whether you therefore are in a position.
Sadly, I wasn't. I've only just resumed. But is it appropriate for me to go on to the second, rather than try and explore in the blind the points there? If there's other colleagues on the panel who can see a follow-up question that should be asked, please do.
I think Mr. Penman's response was fairly full on the question of the balance between central management of special advisors and responsibility specifically to ministers. Certain lack of clarity around one or two of those areas, but I think it would be appropriate to go on to the next question if you would be happy to do that.
Yes, certainly, and my apologies for the break in transmission. Anyway, let's move on. What are your views on the bullying and harassment situation in Parliament? You commented quite favourably earlier on in the hearing about the progress that have been made. How do you think the establishment of the independent expert panel is working, and is that a model that should be considered in another context?
I think, you know, we welcome the changes that were made. As I say, we were quite heavily involved in helping to design those changes, as well as kind of campaigning and lobbying to to allow or to try and persuade Parliament to make those changes themselves. I think what we have in Parliament is an infrastructure that creates that separation and that independence to build confidence in individuals challenging behaviour where it's inappropriate. I think it's too early to tell whether those kind of cultural issues around, because it's not just about having a process, it's about how it's operated, it's about how people behave, it's about whether when it's tested it's effective or not and visible around that. Those things in organisations take years and years to really kind of bed in, just like those kind of cultural issues that operate badly take a long time to kind of change and create those kind of long-term issues. So I think it's too early to tell. I think we have the right infrastructure in place there, and I think we really welcome that the final decision that Parliament took essentially around ensuring that, you know, ultimately when it came to some of the more significant sanctions, there wasn't going to be a debate in the House about them. And actually that power, you talk about it with a kind of, it's been one of the issues around the Prime Minister's power in the Ministerial Code. Parliament's willingness to delegate power. Power also means about the willingness to delegate it and recognising at times you have to give it away and give it to other people because that's appropriate. Because there's a potential conflict. That doesn't mean you don't have that power, you've just done that. And Parliament doing that, I think, was really critical. So I think we are quite confident about the processes. They will always be improved. And they also, it's about how they are kind of lived through. So is there sufficient resources, as you talked about in the previous question? So I think, you know, we're actively involved. We gave evidence last week to the Standards Committee about all of this as well. So we're monitoring, we're seeing it, but I think really it's an exemplar across public administrations around how you create an independent process.
That's very encouraging. Do you think that sense of improvement is shared by the staff who are under that code, under the new regime? Do you get the sense that confidence is building?
I think so in terms of, and I think one of the challenges in Parliament is it's quite a difficult situation if you're a member of the House staff, where it's a large organisation that has an HR function, and therefore there's much more support for your employers and dealing with issues before they end up at the complaint stage. I think part of the difficulty in Parliament is the kind of myriad of employment relationships, including for MPs themselves, and parliamentarians, where they're essentially small employers without that kind of HR function, and the sort of issues that we would deal with as a union or advise members quite often to resolve themselves are quite difficult to resolve when you have, you know, 650 employers dealing with kind of 3 or 4 employees, and there's no management structure, there's no support. And I think that's one of the issues around it. So whilst you've got infrastructure in place, you've also got some further challenges, and that experience and confidence in the process, I think, might be different whether you were a member of House staff or whether you were an employee of a parliamentarian.
Yes, and you might add rapid turnover of staff in those parliamentary offices as well. Do you think, looking at it overall, that the standards regime in Parliament is now, and the regulatory environment there is now better than it is for ministers and the ministerial and government codes?
I think undoubtedly, and the way to test that is say, well, if the same set of behaviours were undertaken by a minister in Parliament against a parliamentary member of staff, and they walked up Whitehall, did the same thing to a civil servant, how would those two things be dealt with? If you were the employee subject to that behaviour from a minister in Parliament or the civil service, how confident would you have? Would you understand how that investigation would be made? What input could you have to it? Would you have confidence in the decision-making process? Could you challenge a decision if you felt it was unfair? And you've got 2 very different standards applying, separated by 100 yards of Whitehall, essentially. And I think that demonstrates why you need to separate these issues out from the ministerial code and create a standard and a process that is centred around those who are going to challenge inappropriate behaviour, and then find out how the relationship between that and the ministerial code needs to apply and link, but actually create an entirely separate process.
Thank you very much. Can I just, as we move towards the end of this session, can I ask one other question? Without getting into specifics, we have noted that there are a number of instances in the last year or two where what might traditionally have been seen as standards issues have ended up before the courts in one form or another. And we're reflecting on that and whether that is something that is just the nature of the way in which the courts now operate, whether it's actually an indicator that the more traditional standards models have not necessarily delivered as well as they might, or whether this is something should be welcomed or something that should not be welcomed. I wonder whether you have a wider perspective on that trend, although not talking about particular cases.
Of course. I think there's a difficulty here because clearly you can have the best standards regime in the world, and some people would want to challenge or see some other motivation in challenging through the courts. I think, therefore, there's a point in saying, well, it doesn't necessarily demonstrate there's a failure of the standards regime, but because people challenge in the court for a variety of reasons, just like any, people can make a challenge under the ministerial code as mischief making, rather than actually being a genuine complaint under the code. So I think it's about saying whether they are legitimate challenges or not just the kind of frequency of them. Do they have some merit? Are they as a result of what should have been, in other terms, either a failure of the system or the application of the system that's then that's led to this kind of challenge around it? And that really is the test around whether it's appropriate for the courts or not, I think. So I think it informs that process, and the outcome of those legal challenges clearly will inform that process as well, about whether they were successful or not, and whether there needs to be lessons learned around it. Taking litigation is not an easy or cheap process, and particularly, depending on the nature of the litigation, it can be quite expensive and quite risky in relation to the other side's costs. So the one thing I would say is that, quite often that's not the first course of action for individuals because of that. And therefore, I think that's part of the context of it, saying that, has it because there's been no other choice, and people have embarked on quite a risky financial enterprise in relation to challenging the courts, rather than just being something as a kind of easy tactic or political tactic around it.
Mr. Penman, thank you very much indeed for your evidence this morning. Very helpful and informative from our point of view, and we're grateful for you making the time. I think we have used up the time allocated to ourselves.